Hi, all. So this is our first art appreciation lecture. I will be doing 15 of these this semester as far as art periods. So that's what I mean to say is the art period lecture. You can follow along in the workbook with me. I'm on page 119. Today I'll talk about Renaissance art period. And these are simply quick drive-bys, exposure to the art periods, the influence they have, and what they're representing, the characteristics of the time, the visual elements that are predominant, what the thinking is of the time, and generally the characteristics of that particular art period. So the Renaissance was from 1330 to 1527. It was about 200 years. And I talk about this that there's different reasons that art periods last the times that they do. In this particular case, this was a very rich, intellectually rich, and stimulating time. Matter of fact, it's described as the rebirth, as man is coming out of the dark ages and starting to have these new ideas and exploring life from the heavens to the earth. As a matter of fact, that is different because up to this point, the church has pretty much led the thinking and told people, given them their information, told them what to think and how to think about life and how to approach life. And now, not leaving religion, but in concert with the church, humans are starting to think about their role as people on Earth, and new sciences are emerging, and it's just a really exciting time. The statement that I use to describe the Renaissance is alignment of ideas of learning, reason, and self-expression with religious dogma. So that's basically exactly what I just said. Alignment of ideas of learning, reason, and self-expression with religious dogma. So the church is not being discounted or disregarded. There's still a major influence, the Catholic Church, especially in Europe, but man is starting to think of themselves separate. And this goes along with some of the characteristics of the time. So is what's being explored is the artists are trying to accurately reflect people, the world. And it goes so far as Leonardo da Vinci literally dissecting cadavers to understand muscle structure and anatomy. And this is one of the sciences that's emerging in conjunction with the art, where up to this point, the artists had simply not spent as much time trying to accurately reflect the human anatomy, the human body, and now the artists are very focused on trying to get muscle structure right and the proportions, the balance. So that's where characteristics of this time is accurate perspective. So as you're trying to reflect the world accurately, you want to make sure that if I look in the distance, the tree in the background, the scale of it compared to a tree in the foreground, is that it's going to be smaller, so it makes it look like it's in the distance. This is perspective. It shows depth, atmospheric perspective. Matter of fact, I always like to, on page 280 in your textbook, there's a picture at the top where it shows the characters that are the clothes is the body. And this is where, as the artists become better, they start developing this. And so then the clothes are laying on top of the body. And this is a major distinction. Balance and proportion are very important. The art in the during the Renaissance, it's important that it's balanced. I jumped to, well, you can look at Botticelli's Birth of Venus on page 283. She's right in the center. It's balanced. It fits, and proportions are accurate. Perspective is accurate. The artists are starting to explore the use of light and dark and shading to create this realistic look. So on page 284 in your textbook, you have Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. And by the way, Mona Lisa is the work of art that is part of your art reflection. So when you're answering the questions today, use what I'm talking about in the lecture, You can use the notes within the workbook, and you should be able to answer the questions pretty easily. But Mona Lisa is a great example of she's balanced in the center of the page. One of the visual elements is she's her placements. Everything else is subordinate to her. It's behind her. It's lesser than her. It's smaller than her. That small scale makes it feel like it's in the distance. So you have this perspective. In this case, you have a 1-point perspective because everything vanishes at 1 point on the horizon. Also, in this painting done by Leonardo da Vinci, there's a process called chiaroscuro. And this is something that is developed during the Renaissance by Leonardo da Vinci. It's a simple style of shading, excuse me, where it takes round shapes, because really art is simply an illusion. It's paint on a canvas, and then artists use shapes to and places them together to start creating this illusion where we see what we see. And so when we look at Mona Lisa, we literally see a woman sitting looking out at us. We're really, it's just paint on a canvas, but we see this. And so what are the techniques that artists use to create the illusion that we see a woman looking at us? And chiaroscuro is one of the types of shading that gives a round oval where it feels like it has depth to it. So in this case, her hands or her face, it looks like it has depth and it looks realistic to us. Next, as a matter of fact, staying with balance, another Leonardo da Vinci is The Last Supper, which is on page 285. Visual elements that Da Vinci uses here is balance. So we have this perception of weight. And it's perception because, once again, it's paint on a canvas. It doesn't weigh anything. Excuse me. But we feel like those bodies weigh a certain amount. And it has volume. The shapes feel like they have mass to them. It's the illusion. It's what we see. It's what we add to it because it's what we recognize and we add to this painting. But it looks like there's equal weight with Jesus in the center. So there's this balance. There's pattern. The windows on the side and create this rhythm so that your eyes follow along. This is another example, 1-point perspective, where everything vanishes to 1 point on the horizon, which is actually behind Jesus' head in the distance. Atmospheric perspective is something. Now, I'm using these visual elements because our next assignment, maybe it's this week, that actually I think it's next week. Sorry, so it's a visual element, but you will actually be trying to identify visual elements within a painting and then giving us the definition. So that's why I'm throwing out. So pay attention to these different visual elements as I'm describing them. Michelangelo, page 286, an artist during this time, and you have David, and Michelangelo's sculpture of David shows a couple things, because the artists of the time, even though they were starting to explore the human body, they were still pulling on the ideas of antiquity, the Greeks and the Roman classic images, and that's where David is. Even though it's accurately representing the human body, he still has this godlike, heroic aspect to him. He seems bigger than life. And so even though the Renaissance artists were trying to represent the world accurately, they're still pulling on this heroic side. So it's not quite yet average. Like, for instance, we'll look in the future, in future classes, we'll look at realism, where the artist wouldn't do that. They would make the sculpture the actual size, or the recreation where there's no enhancements. There's nothing that makes it look more godlike or different than human. They actually wanted to capture life exactly as is. The Renaissance is a start in this, but they still have these influences that are keeping them, that gives this higher level to it. Jan van Eyck, the picture on 289, you have this is a nice example where Van Eyck actually was starting to work with oils and developing these very rich colors in his process. So we're not only are we trying to represent the world accurately, we're trying to get the colors and the richness of the worlds that's reflected on the canvas. Let's see who else. I thought I saw Donatello in here, artist of the time. Um, yeah, page 282, sculpture by Donatello. So that is a great example where Donatello is accurately reflecting the human form compared, and you put that, and this is actually also titled David. So they're both reflecting this story from the Bible, and this is Donatello's representation of that, and then Michelangelo's representation is that larger David. Well, I think the last thing I would say is if you think about the influences of the time, and this is always important to understand why we're seeing what we're seeing. So the church was a heavy influence. So there still was religious themes. That David is a story from the Bible, but at the same time, on the other page, you got Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus. That's pulling on the god influences, those Greek goddess stories. So you're starting to combine these different worlds coming together as we're trying to figure out who we are and where we fit in the world. All right, so that's the Renaissance. You have this is one of the three, and then you'll have quiz one that asks you about the Renaissance, and I think it's Baroque and I can't remember right offhand, the Rococo. So the first quiz will be on Renaissance, Rococo, and the one that I just said, Baroque, Rococo, Baroque, and Renaissance. Sorry. So you'll listen to two more lectures. They'll be like this. I'll try to keep them as short as I can. And so see you next time.